Peter Langston once held enough gold dust in his saddlebags to buy every acre of Montana Territory grassland from the Bitterroot River to the Yellowstone, and he gave it all away for the sound of a dying man's voice asking him to keep his word. It was the spring of 1876, in the shadow of the Bitterroot Mountains, in a scrappy cattle and mining town called Copper Creek that had sprung up along a fork of the Clark's Fork River. The town had one dusty main street lined with false front buildings, a general store, a telegraph office that received news from Helena 3 days late, a saloon called the Silver Dollar, and a bank owned by a man named Elias Cordell who held more mortgages on more homesteads than any other soul for 50 miles. Copper Creek smelled of horse sweat, wood smoke, and the promise of something better just over the next ridge, the way every mining town in the territory did in those years after the war, when men who had lost everything back east came west looking to win it back with a pick and a pan. Peter Langston had ridden into that country in the first thaw of April, a lean man of 29 years with sun-browned skin, a thick mustache, and eyes that had seen more of the war between the states than he cared to speak of. He had served as a Union cavalry scout in the last 2 years of the fighting, riding dispatches through Confederate lines in Tennessee and Georgia when he was barely more than a boy. And when the war ended, he had drifted, as so many restless veterans did, first to Kansas, then to Colorado, and finally up into Montana Territory chasing rumors of gold in the gulches above the Bitterroot. He was not a greedy man by nature, but he was a man without a home, and gold, he had come to believe, was the only thing in this hard country that could buy a man a home of his own, land he could call his, a life that did not depend on the charity or cruelty of others. He carried with him a mule named Solomon, a battered Henry rifle, a canvas tent, and the quiet, stubborn hope that somewhere in those granite hills he would find the vein that would change his life. He found trouble before he found gold. 3 days after he crossed into the Bitterroot foothills, following a game trail up a narrow draw where a creek ran silver over black stone, Peter Langston was set upon by 2 claim jumpers, rough men named Cutter and Finch, who had been robbing prospectors along that stretch of the mountains all winter, taking their tools, their dust, sometimes their lives. They came upon him at dusk, when his fire was low and his guard down, and though Peter fought them with the desperate strength of a man defending the only thing he owned, a rifle butt caught him across the temple, and a knife found his ribs before he managed to put a bullet into Cutter's shoulder and send both men fleeing into the dark, cursing and bleeding. He did not remember much after that. He remembered the taste of blood in his mouth, the cold ground beneath him, the stars wheeling overhead like a slow, indifferent clock. He remembered thinking, with the strange calm of a man who believes he is dying, that it was a foolish thing to bleed to death alone in the mountains for the sake of gold he had not even found yet. And then he remembered nothing at all, until he woke to the smell of wood smoke and beef broth, and the sound of a woman's voice, low and steady, telling him to lie still. That woman was Myrtle Lawson. She was 23 years old that spring, though the hard work of the homestead had given her hands the calluses of a woman twice her age, and a spine that never seemed to bend, no matter what burden was laid across it. She had been riding the fence line that ran along the eastern edge of her father's ranch, looking for a break where the cattle had been slipping through, when she found Peter Langston's mule standing patient and riderless beside the game trail, and Peter himself lying in a crumple of blood-soaked shirt in the brush nearby, more dead than alive by the look of him. She was not a woman given to panic. She had buried her mother 11 years before, nursed her father through injuries and fevers more times than she could count, and learned early that the frontier did not wait for a person to compose themselves before demanding action. She bound his wound with strips torn from her own petticoat, got him across her saddle with a strength that surprised even her, and led both horses and the mule the 4 miles back to the Lawson Ranch house, a low log structure with a stone chimney that her father had built with his own hands the year Myrtle was born. Silas Lawson met her in the yard, an old rancher of 58 years with a face like weathered saddle leather and a heart weakened by a fall from a horse 2 winters past that the town doctor said had never properly healed. He took one look at the stranger slumped across his daughter's saddle and did not ask questions. He simply helped carry the man inside, laid him on the bed that had once belonged to Myrtle's brother, killed at Shiloh 13 years before, and told his daughter to fetch the whiskey and the sewing needle, because there was work to do before sundown. For 3 days Peter Langston hovered between fever and waking, and for 3 days Myrtle Lawson sat beside him, changing the dressing on his ribs, spooning broth between his cracked lips, wiping the sweat from his brow with a cloth dipped in creek water. When he finally opened his eyes on the 4th morning and found her sitting there in the gray dawn light, her chestnut hair loose about her shoulders and her eyes the color of good coffee, he thought for a moment he had died after all and gone somewhere kinder than he deserved. "You are not an angel," he said, his voice a dry rasp, "though I confess I had my doubts a moment ago." Myrtle Lawson allowed herself the smallest of smiles, the kind she rationed carefully in those hard years. "No, sir. Just a rancher's daughter with more mending to do than sense to avoid it. You are lucky Cutter and Finch didn't finish what they started, or lucky I found you before the wolves did, one or the other." "Cutter and Finch," Peter repeated, trying to sit up and failing, pain lancing through his side. "You know them. Everyone in this valley knows them. Claim jumpers. They've robbed half the prospectors coming through here since the first snow melted. Sheriff Briggs has been after them for months, but they know these mountains better than he does." She set down the cloth and studied him with the frank appraisal of a woman used to judging horses, cattle, and men by their bearing rather than their words. "What's your name, mister?" "Peter Langston," he said. "Late of the Ohio Cavalry, more recently of nowhere in particular." "Well, Peter Langston," she said, "you are going to lie still in that bed until my father and I say otherwise, or you will undo 3 days of careful stitching and I will be very put out with you." He obeyed, not because he was a man accustomed to taking orders from women, but because something in her voice, in the steady competence of her hands, in the tired grace of her face, made him want to please her, even flat on his back with a hole in his side. It was during those long weeks of recovery, while the Bitterroot snow retreated further up the peaks, and the meadows below turned green with new grass, that Peter Langston came to know the Lawson family and the trouble that hung over their heads like a gathering storm. Silas Lawson had homesteaded that valley in 1863, one of the first men to bring cattle into that stretch of Montana territory, back when the Blackfeet and Salish still hunted freely across those grasslands, and the nearest law was a 3-week ride away. He had built his herd slowly, honestly, through hard winters and harder summers, and he had buried a wife and a son in the small cemetery on the hill behind the house, and he had raised a daughter who could rope a steer, shoot a rifle, and recite scripture with equal skill. But 2 winters back, a bad fall from his horse during a blizzard had cracked 3 ribs and the doctor said, weakened something in his heart that would never mend. He had been forced to hire on help he could not fully afford, and when a dry summer thinned his herd and a harsh winter thinned it further, he had gone to the Copper Creek bank for a loan to see the ranch through, never suspecting that the banker who held his note, Elias Cordell, had his own designs on the Lawson land. Elias Cordell was a heavy-set man in his 50s with small, calculating eyes and a talent for smiling while he ruined people. He had come to Copper Creek 5 years before with money from somewhere back east, money that had built the bank and bought up half the town's businesses, and money that he used, patiently and ruthlessly, to acquire land. Word had come down from railroad surveyors that the Northern Pacific Line, still years from completion, but already casting its long shadow of speculation across the territory, might run a spur through the Bitterroot Valley, and the man who owned the land along that proposed route stood to make a fortune selling right-of-way and depot ground to the railroad. Cordell had quietly bought up every failing homestead within reach of that surveyed line, and Silas Lawson's ranch, with its water rights and its level ground along the creek, sat squarely in the path of Cordell's ambitions. The note Silas had signed carried a due date of the 1st of November, 1876, and a sum that grew larger every month as interest compounded in ways Silas, an honest man unused to banking tricks, had not fully understood when he signed it. Myrtle had discovered the truth of it only that winter, going through her father's papers while he lay abed with a fever, and the number she found there had made her sit down hard on the kitchen floor and stay there a long while before she found the strength to stand again. "He'll take the ranch if we can't pay," she told Peter one evening in early May, as he sat propped against the porch rail, strong enough now to take the evening air though not yet strong enough to mount a horse. The sun was going down gold and red behind the peaks, painting the pasture in long shadows, and somewhere out in the dark a coyote was beginning its evening song. "Mr. Cordell has been very patient," he says, "very understanding of our situation. But patience has a price, and come November, if we don't have the full sum, he'll foreclose and sell to the railroad, and my father will lose the only thing he ever built with his own 2 hands. How much is owed?" Peter asked. She told him, and the number was staggering for a homestead ranch, nearly $4,000 including the compounded interest, more money than most men in that country would see in 10 years of honest labor. "That's a fortune," Peter said quietly. "It is to us," Myrtle said, and there was no self-pity in her voice, only a flat, tired honesty. "Mr. Cordell's son, Wendell, has been calling on me since Christmas. I think his father hopes that if I marry Wendell, the debt simply disappears into the family, and Cordell gets the land without the unpleasantness of foreclosing on a sick old man in front of the whole town. Wendell is not a bad sort, I suppose. But I do not love him, and I will not be sold like a heifer at auction to save my father's pride." Peter Langston said nothing for a long moment, watching the light fade over the mountains he had come to find his fortune in, and something in his chest, some old soldier's instinct for injustice, tightened like a fist. He had seen enough of the world by then to know how often it ground down the honest and rewarded the ruthless, how often a woman's only shield against poverty was a marriage she did not choose, how often the law in these territories bent toward whoever held the most gold rather than whoever held the most right. He did not say any of this to Myrtle Lawson that evening. He only reached over, with the boldness of a man who had nearly died and found something worth living for, and took her hand where it rested on the porch rail, and she did not pull it away. Silas Lawson's health did not improve with the coming of summer. If anything, the worry over the note seemed to hasten what the fall from the horse had begun, and by the time the meadow grass stood knee-high and the cattle had fattened on it, the old rancher was spending more days abed than up, his breath coming shorter, his color grayer, his once strong hands trembling when he lifted a cup of coffee to his lips. Peter, fully recovered by then, had taken to helping Amos Kilbride, the Lawsons' one remaining hired hand, an old cowboy of perhaps 60 years who had ridden for the Lawson brand for 2 decades and loved Silas and Myrtle as if they were his own blood. Between them, Peter and Amos kept the herd moving, the fences mended, the hay cut and stacked for winter, and in the evenings Peter sat with Silas, and the 2 men talked of the war, of cattle, of the strange twisting fortunes of a territory still finding its shape. It was on one of those evenings in late July, with the lamp burning low and Myrtle asleep in the next room after a day of harvest work, that Silas Lawson took Peter's hand in his own trembling grip and said the words that would shape the rest of Peter Langston's life. "I am not a fool, son," Silas said, his voice thin but steady. "I know what's coming for me. Doc Whitfield doesn't need to tell me plain, though he tries to be kind about it. My heart is failing, and it will fail before that note comes due in November, one way or another." "Silas, don't. Let me finish," the old man said, with a flash of the stubbornness that had built a ranch out of raw prairie. "I have watched you these past months, Peter Langston. I have watched how you look at my daughter, and I have watched how she looks at you, though she thinks I am too blind to see it. You are a good man, a man who keeps his word, or I am no judge of character at all." "I try to be," Peter said quietly. "Then hear me. I do not ask you to marry her out of pity or out of any debt you feel for her nursing you back from death's door. I ask only this. Promise me you will not let Cordell take this land. Promise me you will look after Myrtle, whatever it costs you, whatever you must trade away to do it. I have nothing to leave her but this ranch and her own good sense, and if Cordell takes the one, I fear what it will do to the other, watching everything her mother and I built turned into a railroad depot for that man's profit." Peter Langston looked into the fading eyes of a dying man and understood, with the clarity that comes only in such moments, that he was being asked to give his word on something far larger than he could yet promise to deliver. He had no fortune. He had a half-explored claim up in the hills, unproven, and a heart full of love for a woman he had known only 4 months. But he understood, too, that a promise made to a dying man was not a thing to be measured against the odds of keeping it. It was a thing to be given whole and then earned, however long that took. "I promise you, Silas," Peter said, and his voice did not waver. "Whatever it costs me, I will not let Cordell take this land, and I will look after Myrtle for as long as she will have me. You have my word as a soldier and as a man." Silas Lawson closed his eyes, and something like peace settled over his weathered face. "Then I can rest easy," he said. "That is all a father wants in the end, to know his child will be looked after by someone worth the trusting." Silas Lawson died 11 days later, in the small hours of an August morning, with Myrtle's hand in his and Peter standing quiet in the doorway. He went peacefully, the doctor said, his heart simply stopping in his sleep, and there was a mercy in that even as there was a grief too large for words. They buried him on the hill behind the house, beside his wife and his son, and the whole valley turned out for the funeral, for Silas Lawson had been well loved, a fair man in a country where fairness was often in short supply. Elias Cordell attended the funeral too, standing at the back in a black coat too fine for a rancher's burial, his face arranged in an expression of solemn sympathy that did not reach his eyes. He offered Myrtle his condolences, and then, with a smoothness that made Peter's jaw tighten, he reminded her gently that the note would still come due on the 1st of November, regardless of what grief the household was suffering, and that his offer regarding Wendell still stood, should she wish to spare herself further hardship. Myrtle thanked him with icy courtesy and did not answer the offer at all, and Peter Langston, standing at her side in his one good shirt, made a silent vow that he intended to keep far sooner than he expected. In the weeks after the funeral, grief and practicality tangled together in the Lawson household as they do in every household touched by loss. There was a ranch to run, a herd to manage through the coming winter, and a debt that grew larger by the month with Cordell's compounding interest. Peter had already told Myrtle in the days before Silas died about the ground he had been working before Cutter and Finch waylaid him, a narrow gulch 2 days' ride into the mountains where the creek gravel had shown color in his pan, more color than he had found anywhere else in a year of prospecting. He had not had time to properly stake or work the claim before the attack, and it weighed on him now with new urgency. "I have to go back up there," he told Myrtle one evening in early September, as they sat together on the porch where he had first held her hand, the mountains behind them already dusted with early snow on their highest peaks. "If there's real gold in that gulch, it could be enough to pay off Cordell's note outright with money left besides. I gave your father my word, Myrtle. I mean to keep it, and the only way I know how is to go find that gold." Myrtle studied him for a long moment, her eyes bright with unshed tears that had little to do with grief and much to do with fear of losing him too, so soon after losing her father. "You could die up there," she said. "Cutter and Finch might still be lurking those hills. Or the cold might take you, or a fall, or 100 other things that take men in these mountains every year. I could, Peter admitted. But I gave my word, and I intend to keep it, and I think, Myrtle Lawson, that I have come to love you enough these past months that I would rather risk dying trying to save your home than live safely and watch you lose it. It was the first time either of them had said the word love aloud, and it hung in the cool evening air between them like something almost visible. Myrtle Lawson, who had not cried at her father's funeral because she had refused to let Cordell or the whole gossiping town see her broken, found herself crying now, quietly, into Peter Langston's shoulder, and he held her there on the porch until the stars came out, and neither of them said anything more that needed saying. He left 3 days later, with Amos Kilbride's blessing to look after the ranch and Myrtle in his absence, and with a promise from Myrtle that she would hold Cordell off as best she could until Peter returned, one way or another, before the snow closed the high passes for good. Peter did not go alone. In Copper Creek, he found Jubal Hayes, an old friend from his cavalry days who had drifted into the territory the year before and taken up prospecting himself with modest success. And Jubal, hearing the whole story over a bottle of rye in the back room of the Silver Dollar Saloon, agreed at once to throw in with Peter for a share of whatever they found. "A promise to a dying man," Jubal said, shaking his head with something between admiration and disbelief. "That is a heavier thing to carry than gold, Peter. You always were a fool for doing the right thing even when the smart thing was standing right beside it, waving its hat." "Maybe so," Peter said, "but I'd rather be that kind of fool than any other kind." They rode up into the mountains together in mid-September, packing tools, powder, and enough provisions to see them through 6 weeks if they were careful. And they found the gulch again after 2 days of hard climbing, a narrow scar of black rock and rushing water hemmed in by lodgepole pine and granite cliffs. Peter staked his claim properly this time, filing the paperwork with the recorder's office in Copper Creek before they left, and then the two men set to work with picks, pans, and a rocker box they built from lumber they hauled up by mule. What they found in that gulch over the following 3 weeks was beyond anything either man had dared hope. The creek gravel yielded color from the very first pan, and when they traced the source upstream to a quartz outcrop veined with visible gold, Jubal Hayes let out a whoop that echoed off the granite walls and startled a pair of elk grazing on the far slope. "Peter," he said, kneeling beside the outcrop with a chunk of quartz in his shaking hands, gold glinting through it like frozen lightning, "I have prospected from Colorado to the Caribou, and I have never in my life seen a vein like this one. You are about to be a very, very rich man." They worked that vein through the last weeks of September and into October, crushing quartz, panning gravel, filling pouch after pouch with gold dust and small nuggets, until Peter's saddlebags and 2 extra pack panniers groaned with a weight of gold that, by even a conservative estimate, was worth well over $10,000 at the assay prices of that year, a fortune beyond anything either man had imagined when they rode up into those mountains. Enough to buy not just Silas Lawson's ranch free and clear but half the valley besides, enough to make Peter Langston, in the space of a single autumn, one of the richest men in Copper Creek. He thought of Silas Lawson every day he worked that claim, and he thought of Myrtle Lawson every night as he lay beneath the stars in his canvas tent, and the closer the gold piled up in his packs, the more he understood something that surprised him. The gold itself had stopped mattering to him almost as soon as he found it. It was only a means now, a tool to keep the promise he had made, and the thought of handing every ounce of it over to secure Myrtle's home and Myrtle's hand did not feel like sacrifice at all. It felt like the easiest decision of his life. While Peter Langston chased his fortune in the mountains, life in Copper Creek and on the Lawson Ranch had grown harder for Myrtle in ways both large and small. Elias Cordell, sensing weakness in a household without its patriarch and without its new protector, had grown bolder in his pressure. He called on Myrtle himself in late September, riding out to the ranch in his black buggy with his son Wendell beside him, and made his offer plain in a way he had never quite dared while Silas lived. "Miss Lawson," he said, standing in her own front room with his hat in his hands and false regret on his face, "I do sympathize with your situation, truly I do. But a bank cannot run on sympathy, and the note comes due the 1st of November regardless of the season's grief. I am prepared, however, to forgive the entire debt, every dollar of principal and interest, if you would consent to marry my son Wendell before that date. It would spare you the indignity of foreclosure, and spare this valley the unpleasantness of watching a good family lose everything they've built." Wendell Cordell, standing beside his father, had the decency at least to look uncomfortable, twisting his hat brim in his hands and not quite meeting Myrtle's eyes. He was not, Myrtle thought, a cruel young man, only a weak one, content to let his father arrange his life and his marriage as though both were simply more property to be acquired. "Mr. Cordell," Myrtle said, standing very straight in the doorway of the house her father had built, "I thank you for your concern for my dignity, though I notice you seem far more concerned with the land along the creek than with anything else about me. I am not for sale, sir, not to spare a debt, and not to spare unpleasantness. My father built this ranch with his own hands, and I will find a way to keep it that does not involve selling myself to your son like a heifer at the county fair." Cordell's smile thinned but did not disappear. "That is a fine sentiment, Miss Lawson, for a woman with no other prospects, but sentiment does not pay debts. I will expect full payment on the 1st of November, or I will expect the deed to this ranch in its place. I am, as ever, a patient and reasonable man, but my patience, like everyone's, has a limit." He left with Wendell trailing behind him, and Myrtle stood in her doorway for a long while after their buggy had disappeared down the road, her hands shaking with a fury she had not allowed herself to feel in front of them. It was in that moment, more than any other, that she understood something about the world she lived in, a hard truth she had always known in the back of her mind but had never faced so directly. A woman alone in that territory, without a husband, without a father, without money of her own, had almost no protection under the law against a man like Elias Cordell. The homestead laws, the banking laws, the courts themselves in that raw, half-formed territory were built by men and for men, and a woman's claim to her own home, her own future, her own body, could be swept aside by anyone with enough money and enough patience to wait for her to break. She thought of her mother, who had died young from a fever the nearest doctor, 3 days' ride away, could not reach in time. She thought of the women she had known in Copper Creek who had married men they did not love simply because the alternative was starvation or worse. She thought of the Salish families who had once wintered in this same valley before the treaties pushed them onto reservations far from this good water and grass. A different injustice, but cut from the same cloth of power, taking what it wanted from those with no army of lawyers to stop it. The frontier was often called a land of opportunity, and for men like Elias Cordell, men with capital and connections, it surely was. But for women, for the poor, for those already dispossessed, it was too often simply a larger, colder version of the same old unfairness, dressed up in new geography. She did not despair, though. Myrtle Lawson was not built for despair. She wrote to Peter Langston through a supply train headed up toward the mining camps, though she had little hope the letter would find him in time, and she set about, with Amos Kilbride's help, doing everything in her power to hold the ranch together and hold Cordell at bay until either Peter returned or the 1st of November arrived, whichever came first. Peter Langston came down out of the mountains on the 20th of October, 3 days before the note was due, with Jubal Hayes riding beside him, and 2 pack mules loaded with more gold than either man had ever expected to see in one place. They rode into Copper Creek in the gray light of a cold, overcast afternoon, and word of their arrival spread through the town faster than a prairie fire. for a man does not ride into a mining town with mule packs that heavy without every eye in the county turning to watch. Peter did not stop at the assay office, though Jubal urged him to, arguing that they ought to at least weigh and secure the gold before doing anything else. Peter had one destination in mind, and it was not the assay office. He found Myrtle at the ranch, thinner than when he had left, her eyes shadowed with worry but her chin still held high, and when she saw him ride into the yard, alive and whole, she ran to him across the muddy ground without a shred of the careful dignity she had shown Elias Cordell, and threw her arms around him before he had even fully dismounted. "You came back," she said, her voice muffled against his coat. "I told myself you would, but I confess there were nights I was not so sure." "I told you I gave my word," Peter said, holding her close, breathing in the smell of wood smoke and prairie wind in her hair. "I found more up there than I ever hoped, Myrtle. Enough to pay Cordell's note twice over and still have plenty left besides. Your home is safe. I mean to see to that before another sun sets if I have any say in the matter." Myrtle pulled back to look at him, searching his face as though she could not quite believe her own good fortune, and then she laughed, a bright, startled sound that seemed to surprise even herself, the first real laugh Peter had heard from her since her father's death. "You mean it? You truly found gold enough?" "More gold than I know what to do with," Peter said, and grinned, the first easy grin he had worn in weeks of hard climbing and harder mining. "Jubal says I ought to be careful, that sudden fortune has ruined better men than me. But I have already decided what I want to do with most of it, and it has nothing to do with keeping it for myself." They rode into Copper Creek together the next morning, the 30th of October, with Amos Kilbride and Jubal Hayes flanking them, and Peter's gold, weighed and assayed at the bank's own scales under the watchful eye of Sheriff Tom Briggs to ensure fair dealing, came to just over $11,000, a sum so large that Elias Cordell himself came out from behind his desk to see it counted, his small eyes glittering with an interest that had nothing to do with Myrtle Lawson's welfare and everything to do with the sudden, dazzling wealth now sitting in his own bank's vault. "Mr. Langston," Cordell said, his voice smooth as creek ice, "this is a remarkable turn of fortune. I confess I did not expect such a resolution to Miss Lawson's little difficulty. I assume you intend to pay off her note in full." "I do," Peter said. $4,112 by your own bank's figuring, which I notice has grown considerably since Silas Lawson first signed that note 2 years ago. Cordell's smile did not waver. "Interest accrues, Mr. Langston, as it must in any sound business, but I am pleased you have the means to settle the debt so completely. I will have the papers drawn up, releasing the Lawson property from any claim of this bank within the hour." It should have been a simple thing, a payment of debt and the release of a mortgage, and for a moment Peter believed it would be exactly that. But Elias Cordell had not built his fortune in Copper Creek by leaving easy money on the table, and as the clerk began drawing up the release papers, Cordell drew Peter aside, near the bank's front window where the gray autumn light fell across the street outside, and made a proposition that Peter had not seen coming. "Mr. Langston," Cordell said quietly, "I wonder if you might consider a different arrangement, one that would benefit us both. I have it on good authority from the railroad surveyors that your claim up in that gulch, given the quality of ore you have already extracted, may be worth 10 times what you've brought down today, perhaps more, once a proper mining operation is established. I am prepared to offer you a very generous sum, above and beyond the note itself, for the deed to that claim. Enough to pay off Miss Lawson's debt entirely, with a substantial sum left over for yourself, if you would simply sign the claim over to my bank's mining interests." Peter frowned. "Why would I do that when the claim is already mine, and already producing enough gold to solve every problem I came to town to solve?" Cordell's expression shifted subtly from smooth persuasion to something colder. "Because, Mr. Langston, I hold significant influence in this county, more than you may realize. Land titles in this territory are not always as settled as they appear, particularly for claims filed by men who are, forgive me, strangers to this valley, with no long history here to vouch for them. I could make things very difficult for you, difficult enough that even your generous payment today might find itself tangled up in courts and challenges for years, while Miss Lawson's ranch sits in limbo, its ownership disputed, its future uncertain. Or you could sign your claim over to me now, take my generous payment and walk away a wealthy man with Miss Lawson's home secured beyond any doubt, her debt paid, and the whole matter closed cleanly today, this very hour. It was, Peter understood in that moment, a threat dressed up as an offer, the same kind of quiet, legal-sounding extortion that men like Cordell had likely used to build half their fortunes in that raw, half-lawless territory, where the courts were thin, and the judges often as beholden to money as anyone else. Peter thought of the gold sitting in the bank's vault, gold that represented a full year of danger and labor, gold that could set him up for the rest of his life as a wealthy rancher or businessman, gold that Jubal Hayes had already begun making plans around, talking of a house in Helena, of investments, of a life neither of them had ever dared imagine. He thought, too, of Silas Lawson's hand gripping his own on that last night, of the old man's voice saying whatever it costs you, whatever you must trade away to do it. He had thought, when he made that promise, that the cost might be his life, risked in those dangerous mountains. He had not imagined the cost might instead be the entire fortune he found there, traded away not to keep Myrtle's home safe from a debt, which his gold had already accomplished, but to keep it safe from a wealthy man's patient, grinding cruelty, the kind of injustice that did not announce itself with violence but with paperwork and delay, and the slow strangulation of a family's future. "Let me understand you plainly, Mr. Cordell," Peter said, his voice very quiet and very steady. "You're telling me that even after I pay off Silas Lawson's note in full today, with gold weighed and witnessed by your own bank and by the sheriff himself, you would still find a way to make trouble for Myrtle Lawson and her home, unless I hand over my claim to you as well." "I am telling you," Cordell said, "that the world is complicated, Mr. Langston, and a wise man secures his friend's interests as thoroughly as possible, given the tools available to him. Call it insurance. Call it what you like." Peter looked past Cordell, through the bank's front window, to where Myrtle Lawson stood on the boardwalk outside with Amos Kilbride, her face turned up toward the window, watching him with an expression of hope and worry that he knew he would carry in his memory for the rest of his life, however long or short that life turned out to be. He thought of everything that gold could buy him if he kept it. Land of his own at last, a name of his own making, a fortune to build a future free of any man's shadow. And he thought of what it would cost him to give it away instead. Nothing, really nothing that mattered, not compared to the promise he had made and the woman he loved standing outside that window. "Draw up the papers," Peter said. "Both of them. The release on Silas Lawson's note, paid in full from the gold already weighed today, and the transfer of my claim in the gulch, in exchange for whatever sum you consider fair, though I will tell you plainly, Mr. Cordell, that I expect that sum to be generous, and I expect Sheriff Briggs to witness every word of both documents, so that there can be no question ever again about what was promised and what was delivered." Cordell's eyes flickered with something like triumph, quickly masked. "A wise decision, Mr. Langston. I will have my clerk draw up the papers at once." It took the better part of that afternoon to complete the transaction, with Sheriff Tom Briggs standing witness as Peter had insisted, a lean, careful man who read every line of both documents twice before allowing Peter to sign, and who made Cordell add a clause, at Peter's quiet insistence, guaranteeing that no further claims, liens, or challenges of any kind would ever be brought against the Lawson property by Cordell's bank or any interest connected to it, now or in the future. A clause that closed the door forever on the kind of patient, legal cruelty Cordell had threatened. When it was finished, Peter Langston walked out of that bank a man of modest means once more, richer only by a fair payment for his claim that, while far less than the fortune the gulch might eventually yield to whatever mining company Cordell brought in to work it, was still enough to buy a small herd of cattle, repair the Lawson Ranch house, and set aside savings for whatever life came next. He had traded away a fortune that could have made him one of the wealthiest men in the territory, and he did not regret it for one single moment, not when he stepped out onto that boardwalk and saw Myrtle Lawson's face when Amos Kilbride told her what had happened inside. "You gave it all up," she said, when Peter reached her, her voice caught somewhere between disbelief and something that looked very much like tears. "The whole fortune, Peter. For the note, yes, but the claim too. You didn't have to do that. The note alone would have saved the ranch." "Cordell wasn't going to let it rest at the note," Peter said, taking her hands in his, ignoring the small crowd of townsfolk who had gathered on the boardwalk to watch the richest stranger Copper Creek had ever seen conduct his business in the open street. "He was going to find some way to keep coming after your home, Myrtle, one way or another, for as long as it took to wear you down. I couldn't leave that door open, not when I promised your father I'd close it for good. So you gave up being rich," she said, "to keep a promise to a dying man." "I gave up being rich," Peter said, "to keep the only promise that ever mattered to me. Gold is just gold, Myrtle. I can find more of it, or I can live without it entirely and be perfectly content, so long as I have a home worth coming back to, and a woman in it that I love more than any fortune I could dig out of a mountain." There, on the boardwalk in front of half the town of Copper Creek, with Sheriff Briggs looking on with a small, approving smile and Jubal Hayes shaking his head in fond exasperation at his friend's stubborn honor, Myrtle Lawson kissed Peter Langston in full view of everyone, and no one in that crowd, not even the gossips who would talk of little else for a month, thought it anything but exactly right. Elias Cordell, for his part, found less satisfaction in his acquired claim than he had hoped. Word traveled through the territory, as word always does in small towns, of how the wealthy banker had squeezed a fortune out of a grieving young widow's protector under threat of legal harassment. And though Cordell had broken no law that Sheriff Briggs could act on, the story cost him dearly in the court of public opinion, a currency that mattered a great deal to a man who depended on the trust of depositors and borrowers alike. Several of his oldest customers withdrew their business in the following months, and the mining company he eventually brought in to work Peter's old claim found the vein far less rich than the assay reports had suggested, the best of the gold having already been pulled by Peter and Jubal in those 3 hard weeks of digging, leaving Cordell with a costly operation that never quite returned the fortune he had gambled on. It was not the dramatic comeuppance of a dime novel, no shootout on the street or dramatic unmasking, but it was a quiet, fitting justice all the same, the kind the real frontier more often dispensed than the storybooks like to admit, slow and unglamorous but no less real for it. Wendell Cordell, released from his father's marriage scheme, and by all accounts relieved to be so, left Copper Creek the following spring to try his own hand at ranching further north. And though the town saw little of him after that, word eventually came back that he had married a homesteader's daughter up near Fort Benton, and seemed, for the first time in his life, to be building something of his own rather than something his father had arranged for him. As for Peter Langston and Myrtle Lawson, the winter of 1876 settled over the Bitterroot Valley with the particular hush of a first snowfall after a long, hard year, and it found them together at the Lawson Ranch, no longer burdened by debt, no longer threatened by Cordell's schemes, with Amos Kilbride still riding for the brand and Jubal Hayes, who had decided the mining life suited him less than he'd thought once the excitement wore off, taking up work as a hand alongside him. At least for that first winter, before he eventually staked his own more modest claim further up the valley. Peter used what remained of his fortune, after paying off the note and helping Myrtle repair the ranch house's leaking roof and sagging porch, to buy a modest herd of cattle to rebuild what the hard years had thinned, and to set aside a small but respectable sum in the Copper Creek Bank, though he made a point, with a wry smile, of moving his account to the new bank that opened in town the following year rather than continue any dealings with Elias Cordell. He was not a rich man by the standards he might have achieved had he kept his claim, but he was, by every measure that mattered to him, wealthier than he had ever been in his life, for he had a home, a purpose, and a woman who loved him not for any fortune he carried, but for the man he had proven himself to be. They were married on a clear, cold morning in early December of 1876, in the small church that had gone up in Copper Creek 2 years before, with the whole valley turning out for the wedding much as it had turned out for Silas Lawson's funeral 4 months earlier. The same faces gathered now for joy instead of grief. A fitting turn for a community that had watched this particular story unfold with as much investment as if it were their own. Preacher Ezra Cole, an earnest young circuit minister who had married and buried half the county in his 3 years there, spoke the vows over them with the mountains visible through the church's single window, dusted white with the season's first heavy snow, and Myrtle Lawson wore a dress of pale blue wool that had belonged to her mother, altered to fit by the hands of the same women who had brought casseroles to her father's funeral. A community that took care of its own, even when the world outside seemed determined to grind them down. "Do you, Peter Langston, take this woman, Myrtle Lawson, to be your lawful wife?" Preacher Cole intoned. "To have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or for poorer, so long as you both shall live?" "I do," Peter said, and there was something in the way he said it, something that carried the weight of a man who had already learned, in the hardest possible way, exactly what those words meant, who had already chosen poorer over richer once that year, and would choose it again without a moment's hesitation if it meant keeping her. "And do you, Myrtle Lawson, take this man, Peter Langston, to be your lawful husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or for poorer, so long as you both shall live?" "I do," Myrtle said, her voice clear and unshaking, her eyes bright with tears that had nothing to do with sorrow. And when Preacher Cole pronounced them husband and wife, the whole church erupted in the kind of joyful noise that only a frontier community, starved for good news after a hard year, could produce. And outside, the first sun in 3 days broke through the clouds and lit the new snow on the mountains until it burned like the gold Peter Langston had given away, but brighter and worth infinitely more. They spent that first winter as husband and wife, settling into the rhythms of ranch life together, Myrtle teaching Peter the particular knowledge of that land she had grown up with, the way the creek behaved in a hard freeze, the signs that told a person a blizzard was coming a full day before the sky admitted it, the best places to shelter cattle when the wind came howling down off the peaks, and Peter bringing to their marriage the steady, hard-won competence of a man who had survived a war and a mountain wilderness, and had no fear left in him for ordinary hardship. Amos Kilbride stayed on as foreman, growing old and content in the shadow of the family he considered as much his own as any blood relation, and in the spring, Jubal Hayes finally struck a claim of his own worth working seriously, and moved a few miles up the valley, though he remained a frequent guest at the Langston table, especially around holidays, when Myrtle's cooking drew him in like a moth to flame. The years that followed were not without their own hardships, for no life on that frontier ever was. There was a hard winter in 1878 that killed nearly a third of the herds across the valley, though the Langston Ranch, better prepared than most thanks to Peter's careful management, weathered it better than many of their neighbors. There was a scare in 1880 when a prairie fire, started by a careless traveler's campfire, swept down through the dry autumn grass, and came within a half-mile of the ranch house before a providential rain turned the tide. A night Peter and Myrtle spent with wet blankets and shovels alongside every able hand from 3 ranches over, fighting the flames side by side with neighbors who had become, in the years since Silas Lawson's death, something like an extended family bound by shared hardship and shared survival. And there was joy too, abundant joy, the kind that grows naturally in a home built on honesty and love rather than fear and debt. Their first child, a son they named Silas after Myrtle's father, was born in the autumn of 1877, a robust, loud infant who grew into a boy with his father's steady gray eyes and his mother's stubborn chin. A daughter followed 2 years later, named Grace, after no one in particular except the quality Myrtle said had carried them through that terrible year of 1876. And after Grace came a second son, William, born in 1882, completing a family that filled the old Lawson Ranch house with a noise and warmth it had not known since before Myrtle's mother died so many years before. Peter Langston never went looking for gold again, though he kept, in a small wooden box on the mantel of that same ranch house, a single nugget from the claim he had traded away, a reminder he showed his children as they grew old enough to understand the story, not as a lesson in what wealth could buy, but as a lesson in what a promise was worth, and what kind of man chose to keep one even when it cost him everything he thought he wanted. Your grandfather Silas, he would tell young Silas, and later Grace, and later still William, as they sat by the fire on winter evenings while the wind howled outside just as it had howled the night Myrtle first found Peter bleeding in the mountains, asked me for one thing before he died. Not gold, not comfort, not anything for himself at all. He asked me to look after your mother and to keep this land safe for her. And when I found more gold than I ever dreamed of finding, I understood that gold was never the point at all. The point was the promise. A man's word, once given to someone who needs it kept, is worth more than every ounce of gold in every mountain in this territory, because gold can be spent and lost and stolen and forgotten, but a promise kept becomes part of who you are forever, in a way nothing else ever can. Myrtle Lawson Langston, listening from her chair by the window where she did her mending in the evenings much as she had once mended Peter's wounded body, would smile at hearing the story told again, never tired of it despite the years, for she understood better than anyone what it had cost Peter to make that choice, and what it had meant to her, a young woman facing the loss of everything her family had built, to have a man walk into her life who valued a dying man's trust above his own fortune. Elias Cordell died in 1889. Still a wealthy man by most measures, but never again quite so powerful in Copper Creek as he had been in 1876. His reputation permanently tarnished by the story that had spread through the valley of how he tried to squeeze a fortune from a grieving family's protector. His bank passed eventually into other, more scrupulous hands, and the town of Copper Creek grew steadily through the 1880s and 90s as the railroad did eventually come through, though by a different route than Cordell had gambled on, sparing the old Lawson Ranch entirely and leaving it exactly as it had always been, a working cattle ranch along a clear mountain creek, now run by a family that had grown by the turn of the century to include grandchildren who rode the same fence lines Myrtle had once ridden as a girl, looking for gaps where cattle slipped through. Peter Langston lived to see his son Silas take over the day-to-day running of the ranch, and his daughter Grace marry a good man from a neighboring spread, and his youngest son William head off to study at a college in Bozeman, the kind of opportunity that would have seemed like a fairy tale to the young cavalry scout who had ridden into that valley in 1876 with nothing but a mule, a rifle, and a stubborn hope of finding his fortune in the hills. He and Myrtle grew old together in that same ranch house, weathering the ordinary joys and sorrows of a long marriage, burying Amos Kilbride in 1895 in the same small cemetery where Silas Lawson rested, and celebrating countless holidays around a table that never seemed to have an empty chair for long, always filled instead with children, grandchildren, and the occasional aging friend like Jubal Hayes, who never did marry himself but claimed with a wink that watching Peter and Myrtle's happiness over the years had been enough romance for any one man's lifetime. On the evening of their 25th wedding anniversary in December of 1901, Peter Langston took the small wooden box down from the mantel one more time, opened it, and held the single gold nugget up to the lamplight, turning it over in fingers grown thicker and more weathered with the years but still steady, still strong. "Do you ever regret it?" Myrtle asked him, sitting beside him on the porch that had been rebuilt twice since that first evening. They held hands there in 1876, watching their grandchildren chase fireflies in the summer dusk of the following June, though on this particular December evening the porch was closed against the cold, and they sat instead by the fire. "Giving up the fortune, I mean. You could have been one of the richest men in the territory." Peter Langston looked at his wife, 25 years married and still, to his eyes, the same steady, remarkable woman who had found him bleeding in the mountains and refused to let him die, and he set the nugget down gently in his palm and closed his hand around it. "Myrtle," he said, "I have thought about that question more times than I can count over the years, and I will tell you the same answer every single time you ask it. I did not trade a fortune in gold for a promise kept. I traded a fortune in gold for you, for this house, for Sela's and Grace and William, for every single evening we have spent on this porch or by this fire in 25 years, for every winter we have weathered together and every spring we have welcomed side by side. If that is the price of this life, this family, this love, then I would pay it again tomorrow and every day after that without a moment's hesitation, and I would count myself the richest man in Montana territory every single time." Myrtle Lawson Langston leaned her head against her husband's shoulder, the fire crackling warm before them, the gold nugget small and quiet in his closed hand, worth, in the end, far less than the promise it had helped him keep, and far less still than the love that promise had grown into over a quarter-century of shared life in that wild, hard, beautiful valley they had made their home. Outside, the Montana winter pressed cold and silent against the windows, but inside the old Lawson Ranch house, now the Langston Ranch house in every way that mattered, the fire burned on, warm and steady, exactly as the love between Peter Langston and Myrtle Lawson had burned since the spring morning she found him half dead in the mountains, and decided, without knowing it yet, that she had found the man she would spend the rest of her life loving, a man who understood in the end that some things were worth infinitely more than gold, and that the truest fortune a man could ever find was not dug from the earth, but built, patiently and honestly, from a single promise, faithfully kept.